If you feel like the defining global dynamic of our era is this relentless, complicated, and just utterly critical relationship between the West and Russia, you'd be right. The default setting just seems to be suspicion, right? The air is thick with the tension, and the stakes just couldn't be higher. We're talking about a dynamic that affects everything from, the price of gas in Europe all the way to the stability of the entire global nuclear arsenal. But what if there was a comprehensive strategic blueprint for moving past this cycle of isolation and distrust? That's what we dove into today. Our sources outline this methodical strategy. It's called Rebuilding the Bridge. And our mission here is to distill its most crucial and, frankly, surprising elements for you.
And it's a critical distinction to make right up front. The blueprint's goal is not some naive, let's all be friends again fantasy, not at all. It is a strategic, incremental, and multidimensional roadmap. It's designed solely for recognizing mutual interests, like avoiding a catastrophic war, while rigorously managing those fundamental, deep disagreements over things like governance and sovereignty.
And why should you, the listener, care about this? Because this relationship is the decisive variable in global equilibrium. When this system breaks down, the costs are tangible and they're global. We're seeing huge economic inefficiencies where these tit-for-tat sanctions hurt both sides and they just amplify global energy volatility.
And beyond that economic friction, the security risks are just massive. You have arms control regimes eroding, the entire European security architecture is destabilized, and the simple probability of miscalculation, especially near flashpoints like the Baltic Sea or the Arctic, it just rises dramatically.
And crucially, there's that quiet human cost, the severing of those academic, artistic, and cultural ties that have historically acted as that soft power foundation, that necessary background hum of understanding that, often helps prevent the worst outcomes. Okay, so let's unpack this blueprint, starting with how we even arrived at this perilous moment.
To chart a future policy, we first have to understand the patterns of the past. The history of modern West-Russia relations can really be segmented into three distinct eras. Each one left a different psychological imprint. The first, of course, was the Cold War from 1947 to 1991. That was defined by ideological bipolarity, proxy conflicts, and this persistent, deep-seated mistrust, even with mechanisms like the Helsinki Accords that kept a basic line of communication open.
Then came that brief, sort of hopeful post-Soviet thaw from about 1991 to 2008. This was marked by economic liberalization, a surge in energy trade, cultural exchanges. For the West, this felt like integration, right? But for many in Moscow, this era simultaneously fostered this deep resentment over what they saw as Western encirclement, particularly things like the phased expansion of NATO into former Soviet bloc nations.
And that resentment, it just kind of curdled into the third era, the rehardening from 2008 to 22. This is where we saw the return to a security dilemma marked explicitly by the Georgia War, the annexation of Crimea, and the explosion of information wars. The result was deepening sanction regimes and a complete and total breakdown of trust.
So the core lesson the blueprint draws is that periods of constructive, pragmatic engagement, they actually yielded mutually beneficial outcomes. Economic prosperity, shared security structures, whereas tension just always created these reciprocal punitive measures that, frankly, rarely achieved any long-term security gains for either side. The mission now is finding a way back to that constructive engagement while shielding the process from political sabotage.
Which brings us directly to the core barriers blocking the road. And barrier number one is the geopolitical flashpoints. Ukraine remains, understandably, the most sensitive friction area. The blueprint doesn't ignore the immense difficulty, but it proposes a path. A negotiated frozen conflict framework.
Wait, hold on. A frozen conflict? Given the current political reality, isn't that immediately dead on arrival? Does the source offer any kind of roadmap to make that palatable? It requires immense political sacrifice.
It does, and the blueprint absolutely acknowledges that immense difficulty. It frames the proposal not as a simple solution, but as a strategic trade-off. The West and Russia would agree to guarantee Ukrainian neutrality for a defined long-term period, so no NATO membership paired specifically with robust security guarantees for Russia concerning its borders and its interests. It attempts to address the core security doctrine issue on both sides, trading long-term stability for some immediate, really painful concessions.
So that reframes it. It's not an end state, it's a strategic pause.
Yeah.
Let's look north. The Arctic is rapidly opening up because of climate change, which means resource claims and shipping lanes are clashing with environmental concerns.
Yeah, and the proposed solution for the Arctic is highly pragmatic because it sort of bypasses the immediate military sovereignty claims. It suggests creating a multilateral Arctic Governance Council with equal voting power for all stakeholders. But, and this is key, It strictly limits its mandate. It would focus only on scientific research, search and rescue cooperation, and environmental protection. The idea is, by focusing on non-security, technical issues, you can build trust that can maybe later expand.
Okay, so if that's the geopolitical picture, we also have to look at the money, which is barrier two, sanctions and economic pressures. I think what we learned from looking at the sanctions data is that when the West targets these massive sectors like oil or gas, they actually create far greater market volatility for themselves than they achieve in behavioral change from the target nation.
Precisely. The sanctions amplified global energy price swings and created massive sanctions fatigue. What's fascinating here is the proposed dual-track economic approach. It advocates for maintaining pressure sanctions on clearly illegal or unacceptable actions, while at the same time creating sanctions-compatible pathways for essential trade.
So they aren't saying ditch the sanctions, they're saying make them smarter.
Exactly. We're talking about essential commodities, things like agricultural products, renewable energy components. This dual path reduces the collateral damage of the sanctions on global supply chains, and it ensures that cooperation can continue in sectors vital to global security, like food and climate.
And we can't ignore the twin forces of barriers 3 and 4.
Yeah.
Narrative warfare and domestic politics. The blueprint argues that state-aligned media creates these propaganda loops that just stifle public support for diplomacy, makes escalation easier, and compromise basically impossible for political leaders to sell at home.
The solution proposed for this sort of self-defeating cycle is radical incrementalism and institutionalizing the dialogue. For example, proposing a permanent West Russia Parliamentary Assembly.
How does a parliamentary assembly help? I mean, that sounds bureaucratic.
Well, it's designed to be less electorally vulnerable than the executive leadership.
Okay.
If you hand the process to elected representatives across the political spectrum, they can engage in these cross-border exchanges, and they can find small, mutually beneficial outcomes that are far less politically risky than asking a president or prime minister to execute some sweeping policy reversal. It sort of depoliticizes the first steps of normalization.
Okay, that makes sense. Small, structural changes to shift the political ground. Let's move to Section 2 and unpack the really innovative solutions for how diplomacy itself has to change, because traditional diplomacy is clearly too slow for the pace of modern crises. The blueprint calls for what they call a low-intensity, high-frequency framework. They propose two specific new institutions designed for rapid de-escalation. First, a 247 West Russia crisis hotline for immediate technical de-escalation of accidental military incidents. And second, a digital governance forum held biannually, specifically to establish clear cyber norms and share threat intelligence on critical infrastructure security.
And here's where the human element is redefined. They suggest appointing Track 1 Plus envoys. Now, these aren't just regular ambassadors stuck in formal channels. They are highly senior diplomats with the specific mandate to conduct informal, shadow negotiations on the most sensitive topics. Things like the long-term status of disputed territories or Russian-speaking populations in neighboring states.
And why are shadow negotiations better than formal talks?
Speed and insulation. They bypass the immediate need for parliamentary ratification and public media scrutiny. They can test potential compromises in private, measure the political temperature, and then report back before a proposal ever reaches the stage where a public rejection could just collapse the entire negotiation framework. It's a mechanism for failure avoidance, really.
That's a clever way to increase the resilience of the process. And they introduced the resilience model, this three-track structure. You have Track 1 for formal treaties, Track 2 for think tanks and academics, and Track 3 for grassroots exchanges, like cultural festivals.
And the intention is for these tracks to create these viable compromise feedback loops. Track 2 and Track 3 test the waters, They find common ground and viable compromises among experts and the public before this proposal's ever reached the official high-stakes Track I political arena. It builds a kind of public consensus engine.
And given the existing geopolitical splits in international institutions, they also suggest new mediating structures are necessary. Specifically, the Nordic Mediation Hub, hosted alternately in Finland, Sweden, and Norway, capitalizing on their history of diplomacy and perceived neutrality.
Or moving toward the technical realm, the idea of a joint scientific council to mediate disputes on shared resources like climate modeling, deep-sea research, or even space debris. This shifts the argument from ideology to verifiable data.
Let's talk hard security and arms control. This is fundamental. They emphasize revitalizing stability architecture, starting with the New START treaty. While the main treaty expired, the blueprint notes the 2021 to 2026 extension clause as a critical, time-limited confidence-building measure that must be leveraged immediately.
And to make that extension stick, they propose significant verification enhancements. This isn't just counting warheads anymore. We're talking satellite-based monitoring, real-time telemetry sharing, and sophisticated AI-assisted data analysis to verify compliance beyond traditional on-site inspections.
And a major practical measure to reduce the risk of accidental war is the proposal for a Euro-Russian Airspace Situational Awareness Center. Can you explain what that would actually do for the person listening?
Yeah, so this isn't just abstract data sharing. It's about having common visual proof of exactly where satellites, drones, and high-altitude surveillance jets are operating in contested airspace. By sharing real-time data on maneuvers, it drastically lowers the chance of a Cold War-style shoot-down or an escalation based on misread radar. It introduces radical transparency right where friction is highest.
And the cyber arena is unique. Despite all the attribution challenges, the difficulty of proving who launched an attack mutual interests absolutely outweigh rivalry when it comes to, keeping the lights on and the banks running.
The proposal here is clear and stabilizing. Establish a Cyber Incident Coordination Center, or CICC, and agree upon a standardized, no first-use statement for state-sponsored cyber ops against critical infrastructure, meaning power grids, hospitals, financial systems.
Who runs the CICC? Because that sounds like a coordination nightmare.
Well, the blueprint suggests it could be co-led by international bodies like NATO's CCDCOE, which is their Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence, and its Russian equivalent. The point is to transform cyberspace from a contested domain into one focused on mutual defense against non-state actors, which is the shared threat for everyone. Now, let's pivot to the economic core in Section 3. This focuses on pragmatic partnerships, starting with the dual-track energy strategy. It's designed to reconcile European energy security with climate goals while stabilizing Russian revenue and reducing market volatility.
That sounds like a Gordian knot of conflicting goals.
Right.
How does that work in the crucial short term?
They propose an energy trust fund. This fund is it's pretty revolutionary. European utilities would get preferential long-term gas contracts, ensuring supply stability. But crucially, a mandatory portion of those revenues would finance joint climate-friendly projects like carbon capture technologies at Russian fields or methane leakage reduction. It ties fossil fuel revenue directly to decarbonization efforts.
That's a powerful incentive structure. You get guaranteed energy security, and they get guaranteed funding for modernization, all without breaking the existing sanctions framework. But doesn't that just sound like kicking the can down the road on the need to transition away from fossil fuels entirely?
Well, the blueprint addresses that by focusing on the medium-term strategy, renewable energy collaboration zones. They propose joint public-private entities in border regions, say Kaliningrad and the Baltic states, focusing on developing massive offshore wind farms and hydrogen electrolyzer clusters. It turns potential military friction points into areas of shared economic and technological growth, accelerating the transition.
They also advocate expanding non-energy trade, noting that agricultural exchange basic commodities is a low political risk sector. Think the West importing Russian wheat, honey, fertilizers, while Russia imports high-tech agricultural equipment and niche food production technologies. It's collaboration on things people actually need.
And technology transfer has to be highly nuanced. Collaboration should focus on areas where Russian expertise remains world-leading space exploration, nuclear medicine, AI safety research. But this partnership must operate alongside absolutely robust, unwavering export controls on any dual-use items that could be militarized. It's collaboration without compromise on strategic security.
Finally, the people-to-people ties the soft power mechanisms that bypass political gridlock and all that nationalistic rhetoric. They propose a Western Russian academic mobility visa, allowing streamlined study for up to 2 years.
I mean, think about the last time 2 decades of Western students were truly embedded in Russian universities and vice versa. That soft power gap, it takes generations to close. This extends to culture and sport. A rotating European-Russian arts festival, joint hockey leagues, Olympic solidarity programs. They're all designed to soften nationalistic edges by creating shared public interest and respect. These grassroots ties are the third-party engine of normalization, providing political cover for leaders to take those risky steps.
So if this is the blueprint, what does the roadmap actually look like? Because this is a decade-long project, not a single negotiation. The source lays out concrete steps for you, the listener, to track its progress. In 2025, the goal is the quick launch of the Crisis Hotline and the Digital Governance Forum. In 2026, they must renew and expand the New START Treaty, leveraging that 2-year window. 2027 is when the bureaucratic machinery needs to stabilize the global energy market by establishing that energy trust fund.
And then we see longer-term strategic goals, emphasizing the shift from security issues to shared existential threats. We're looking at the ratification of a joint AI ethics charter in 2032 and the establishment of the first joint NATO-Russia SSA center in 2033. This really shows that the journey is designed to build trust first on technical, existential issues before you even tackle the hardest geopolitical ones like borders.
And four guiding principles have to govern this whole long-term endeavor. First, incrementalism over grand gestures. Small, verifiable actions build trust far faster than sweeping pacts that are easily broken.
Second, reciprocity with asymmetry. Incentives must be tailored because the West and Russia have vastly different economic structures, different security concerns. Third, transparency and verification, using those robust monitoring mechanisms like satellite data, AI auditors, and third-party inspectors.
And finally, flexibility. The framework has to be resilient, meaning the mechanisms must allow for pause or recalibration clauses. The goal is to prevent a single breach in one area from collapsing the entire hard-won framework across every other sector.
Yeah, the blueprint's ultimate conclusion is that improving relations requires managed competition and robust collaborative problem solving, especially on shared existential threats like climate, pandemics, cyber vulnerability, not compromising on fundamental democratic values. The old binary West versus Russia narrative just no longer serves any rational purpose in a multipolar, interconnected world.
This deep dive has moved us past that simplistic narrative and into the mechanics of a multi-layered strategy for resilience and, hopefully, cooperation. So here's the final thought for you to mull over. The blueprint suggests that the most profound shifts in international order emerge from a series of modest, concrete technical actions, not from grandiose rhetoric or revolutionary political figures. Given the sheer number of highly technical, non-political initiatives proposed, like pandemic preparedness, space collaboration, and AI governance, can these technical soft links actually build sufficient momentum to force policy shifts on the hard geopolitical issues, like territorial sovereignty? That is the real test of this ambitious roadmap. Thanks for dining in with us.